Hey y'all, I'm Sir Pinkbeard, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to create a photography style setup for rendering your Blender models. Think picture day in high school, you know, where you showed up, there was a backdrop, you sat on a little stool, tilted your head just right and looked over at the camera, and then they snapped your picture, the two lights went off, and then you moved on with your life, and then ended up with an embarrassing high school photo after that. So that style setup, that picture day style setup, that's what we're creating today. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so just like with most Blender tutorials, though not most of mine, we're going to go ahead and delete this default cube here. So simply select the cube and hit X, and then we can also go ahead and delete the light as well, because we're going to be adding in 3 lights on our own, so we don't need the default light or the default cube. But for the camera, we do want to just return this to where it needs to be. So select the camera and then hit Alt-G, which will clear the location on the object. It then turns it to the world origin point here, and we'll also hit Alt-R, which turns the camera down. From there, rotate it 90 degrees on that X-axis. And the last step, all we have to do is move this back on the Y-axis, which means we're actually looking at it from the front now. So there we go. This is our camera view, and it's time to go ahead and create our backdrop. Now, I'm okay with the camera being roughly this far away, but if you want to move it further, we can do that just a little bit further, and that should be good. And then we'll move it up just a bit, so that way it's almost going to be at head level. You don't want the camera level with the floor when you're taking these headshots. So go ahead, place the camera up a little bit, but keep it zeroed on the X-axis just a little bit further on the Y, and there we go. Now it's looking forward. So now that our camera is positioned, let's go ahead and add our mesh background. So we can select in here, Shift A, and then select a plane. Then hit 0 to look at it from the camera view, tab into edit mode on the plane, and then scale this up on the X-axis until the edges of our backdrop are just beyond the view of the camera. The reason for that is when you're rendering in one of these photo style shoots, you don't want anything rendering that isn't in front of the background. So then all we have to do is grab this back edge here and once again extrude up until it's just past the edges of the camera. Now if we look at our backdrop here, it's not going out far enough on the Y-axis for my taste, so I'm just going to extrude it out or just scale it out a little bit on that Y-axis. And the thing that doesn't really make sense is for backgrounds, even if you have like a green screen or a cloth background, they don't just turn at a right angle. They actually have some bevel to it. So let's go ahead and select this edge here and then hit Control B and bevel this out. Now we can come down to the bottom left-hand corner where we have our operator panel and change some of these settings. So I'm gonna go ahead and set in here just 3 segments and maybe increase the offset a bit. Maybe we add in 5 segments, that'll be fine. Yeah, so now it's going to look more like a cloth is hanging down from the top and flowing down onto the ground. So if you ever have to back up your camera so that you get not only the back of the backdrop, but also some of the ground of the backdrop, there's going to be this nice transition in the render. The final step in getting that nice transition is to shade it smooth. So we're just going to right click on it and shade smooth. And now we can't even tell that there are multiple faces. It's just one nice continual design. So if we were to back up the camera here, we wouldn't even be able to tell. Okay, so now we've got that done, it's time to add in the lights. All right, so we're going to use a 3-point lighting system for rendering our images in Blender for this file. So come up to the right, hit the new collection button in the top right-hand corner of the outliner, and then name that collection to lighting, just so that way you can keep it in place. Now, if you don't want to do the organization, that's on you, but keeping your outliner organized is better in the long run. So from here, all we have to do is hit Shift A and add in an area light. Now, if you don't add in an area light, like you make a mistake, you don't have to delete it. All you have to do is go down to the properties panel with the little green light bulb and then change the type of the light from whatever you added to area. Now, the last thing we want to do here is make sure that we are in the material preview viewport shading. So by default, I think we've been here most of the video, but let's come over to the material preview and then turn on scene lights and scene world. Now what this is going to do is it's actually going to show us lighting, and as we move this light, you can actually see the lighting effect start being applied. So we're going to move this up a little bit and then closer to the camera and then over on the x-axis over here. And then we just want to rotate this closer and then on the z-axis so that the line that's showing us the direction the light will be pointing is on the file. I think maybe something like that is probably going to be for the best. From here, we want to increase the power level of this area light to 200. Doing that lights up our entire backdrop. And while there is some darkness over here, we'll fix that when we add in the second area light. The final thing for this area light is we want to make it have a warmer color. So we don't want to just have pure white lighting. That doesn't really look good, as any makeup tutorial YouTuber will tell you. So we're going to add some just off-white color here. Not necessarily yellow, but something closer to yellow, so it's a bit on the warmer side rather than just pure white light here. And then all we have to do is duplicate this light and move it to the other side. So to duplicate the light, just have it selected, hit Shift D, which will duplicate it, and then X to move it over on the X axis. From there, we'll just rotate it on the Z axis until the light is pointing on the other side. Now here's the thing, at this point, it's basically the same exact light because all we did was duplicate it, but we want to offset the warm tones on the right-hand side with some cooler tones on the left-hand side. So what that means is we're going to change the color to, instead of being over here on the yellow, we'll come over and make it slightly in the blue region, something like that maybe. We don't want to go too far into the blue, but you know, you can kind of play around with that. And then we want to lower the power level a little bit. Let's drop it to say 70. So that way the light is still affecting this side. It's not as dark as if we were to turn it all the way to 0, but it's not going to be this overpowering blue hue in the render. So we can pull that back up to, I think let's do 50, not 70. And that'll kind of brighten up this area, and we can move it over on the x-axis just a little bit. And I think that is probably fine. Maybe up, and maybe move this one just a little closer. Okay, I think that light is good, and so now it's time for the third point of light, which will be an overhead light. And the reason we're having this overhead light is to kind of distinguish our models from the backdrop that we're putting them in front of. Okay, so instead of duplicating these lights that we've already created, for this third light, we'll just add in a new area light here and move this up on the Z-axis. Now I'm going to change the shape of this light from square to rectangle, and we're going to pull this light out and make it a little thinner, so that way the light essentially covers the entire section over here. And then we'll move this down just a little bit. And there we go. Now I'll increase this to say 40 watts, which, you know, that could be a bit much. And maybe we don't want to have it directly up against the backdrop, but this will provide some overhead lighting, so that way the models that we're working on and rendering won't look like they just blend into the background. Okay, so that is basically our 3-point lighting system. There's only 2 things left to do for this video, which are apply some material colors to our backdrop, depending on what we're rendering, and then also play around with the ambient lighting. So let's add some color to our backdrop. Now, we don't have to unwrap and texture this because this isn't going to be doing anything other than serving as a backdrop for us. So all we need to do is apply a material with a base color. To do that, just come over to our Properties panel and to the Materials tab. From there, you can either choose an existing material from the drop-down list, which if you're using this render file to render a lot of your Blender models, then you're going to end up with more than a few materials, or you can simply hit the New button and create a new one. Now, I like to name my materials because I use the same render file for all of my thumbnails, and when you get a bunch of different colors there, it can be really confusing for which one you're working with. So take the time, figure out your naming scheme, and then go ahead and name your materials. So I've named mine backdrop_red, but you can name it whatever you want. And then to keep that material there, we're just gonna go ahead and choose the solid red color here. Now, it doesn't really matter what color you choose, I'm just choosing red for the tutorial. And then we wanna save this. because if you end up with more than one material, you can end up in our list with materials that look like this. So if you look closely at this dropdown, you'll see that we have backdrop red, material, which is the default material that comes in Blender, and then 0, material 0.001. Well, this 0 signifies that no object in Blender is currently attached to that material. And if you have any materials in Blender that are not attached to an object and have this 0 next to it, these files will be removed when you save and reload that render file. But we can make sure that all of the materials that we want are stored in Blender regardless of whether they're attached to an object or not. And the way that we do that is simply by coming over to the Fake User button in the right-hand side next to the dropdown, and then just click that. Now, even if we change the material of our backdrop from backdrop red to material, we can see that instead of having a 0, it has this F, which means that it's a fake user and it's going to be saved in the Blender file, so that if we were to reopen the Blender file, this one would be here. And we can do the same thing by clicking on material 001 and also turning this into a fake user material. And let's say we make a green backdrop with this one, so we'll call this backdrop green. And then we can simply change the base color over to the green section, and now we have a green screen render for whatever we're working on. And since it's a fake user, we can switch back and forth between whichever ones we want without having to worry about losing them in the long run. So the last thing that we need to do is set up our ambient lighting for our render. Now remember earlier in the video, we came up here to the top and checked the scene lights and scene world. And so what you actually see around you is the ambient light for the scene. This kind of dark gray is considered the ambient light, but that's probably not what we want. We don't want a dark gray light being applied to our render. So instead, let's go over to the shading tab, and then down here in our shader editor, let's change from object to world. Now we get 2 nodes real quick, and this background node is the one that we really want to talk about for a second. So right off the bat, we have what looks like the blank background, a color slot with this dark gray color in it, which I'll just increase for visibility. And then we have a strength setting. Now we can't see this in effect right now, but if we switch over to viewport shading rendered instead of viewport shading material preview, we can actually see the background color of the world and its ambient light. So this is what it looks like with just some ambient white light coming in through the scene. But let's say we wanted to change everything to green. Well, now we can see that the backdrop is actually really affected by that ambient light. And if we increase the strength, the backdrop gets kind of washed out, except for on the edges, because we had it selected, but now it's actually just completely washed out. And then if we lower that strength down, we can see that the ambient light doesn't affect the scene at all, because now our ambient light is 0. So we can do ambient light with just a color. You know, if you wanted a light blue color, maybe increase the strength for your render. Maybe you're doing a render inside a cave, so you want some cooler tones in your render, that ambient light could be good. But if you don't just want to rely on a particular color, you can also use HRDIs, or high resolution images that are kind of going to apply some lighting effects. Now, you can get HDR textures from basically anywhere that you can find them. HDRIhaven.com has free HDRI stuff so that you can pick the correct ambient lighting for what you're working on. So I have already downloaded a couple though. So once you've downloaded and picked your HDRI, simply add a texture and then an environment texture, and then hit open and find where you downloaded it. For me, I'm going to be using this one, so then we can open the image and then simply click and connect the colors. Then we should see this, which is just the HDRI brought into our world. So as we rotate around, we can actually see the world and the different lighting that is taking effect in here, and we can increase the strength of that to give ourselves some more natural ambient light. So that is basically everything you need to know about how to set up your own 3-point lighting system. The last thing to do though is add in your objects and hit render. So in order to bring in our objects so that we can render them in this file, we simply have to append them. All we have to do is come up to the top, hit File, and then Append. From there, simply navigate to wherever you have the Blender file stored on your computer, Select that Blender file, and then you'll get a list of things that you can append. We want to append the mesh objects though, so we simply click on Object and then select the object that we want to bring into the scene. And now here we have the monkey head from my most recent Skillshare course teaching people the basics of Blender. Simply hit 0, and then we can position this in the scene, rotate it around, scale it up, whatever we need to do to get it ready to render the way that we want to render it. Once you're happy with the placement, all you have to do is hit Render, and then Image. And you can see the final result on the Rendering tab. So if you liked this tutorial, let me know in the comments below or smash that like button. And if you want to see more tutorials like this, consider subscribing. Or you can check out these videos right over here and they'll take you to some of my other tutorials. Otherwise guys, I'm Sir Pinkbeard, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.